The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome to another show of Speaking with the Senator. I'm Senator Kevin Avard, and today we have a really special guest. We recently celebrated Memorial Day, and part of that celebration was a local resident here from Hollis, New Hampshire, John Singer, who was a fighter pilot in World War II. He's 97 years old. And I guess we don't have enough time on this show to talk about all his stories. But today, I want to give you an opportunity to get a glimpse into what he shared with us on Memorial Day. So my guest obviously has a little bit of difficulty with hearing, and we're going to try to speak up very loud for him, but he's got some really, really interesting things to say. So welcome to the show. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. So today, I would like you to share what you shared with us on Memorial Day, this previous Memorial Day. You are a fighter pilot.
No, bomber.
A bomber. All right. Good for you. See, you hear me. This is good. And you were over Austria, and you got shot down.
Correct.
What happened?
Well, our bombers were B-24s, Liberators. And we were based in Italy, and the last mission was to go after an oil refinery at Vienna. Vienna, incidentally, was the second most defensively armed city after Berlin. The oil refinery was southwest of Vienna, and we dropped our bombs, a lot of anti-aircraft, and as we were leaving the target, one of the gunners in back said, "There's a big fire," and the bombardier said, "Well, we expected that. We're bombing an oil refinery." And he said, no, we're on fire. And it turned out that we had picked up from flak through the fuel transfer system, so it was not possible to turn it off. It squirted onto the radar equipment because we were deputy lead at the time, and instead of having a regular bomb sight, we had a radar set up. The flight engineer rapped me on the shoulder and said, "We don't have any more fire extinguishers. They don't work. We're empty." Of course, we only had little ones there. So everyone bailed out. We were at the time about 22,000 feet. Fires, fortunately, don't burn very well at that altitude. So I got singed. I lost some hair and I got a few blisters. But normally, if you're bailing out at the beginning of a formation, you free fall a while so you won't be run into by other airplanes. So when I finally pulled the ripcord, nothing happened, which is a little bit disconcerting.
Yes.
But then I realized that the cord was still in the tube, So I wrapped it around my hand and pulled it again. Now it opened. And I was drifting down on a little farm village in Austria. And as I got closer to the ground, I saw what looked like a grape arbor, but probably was growing hops around the town as tall poles. And not wanting to spit myself, I was steering away from them, and I landed a little bit on the hard side and sprained my ankle rather badly. So they picked me up and was hauling me off to the village gate, which is only a couple hundred yards away, when this character broke out of the crowd and gave me a black eye and a bloody nose. The Austrians pulled him off, and I looked back, and they had him on the ground, and they were beating the daylights out of him. And the man who was carrying me on my right side could speak English, and he said, "Forget you saw that. He's a German, and we don't like him." So they hauled me off, put me in jail, and then the procession started. It's unbelievable, but it's absolutely true. First, the women came, and they brought cheese, sausages, and bread. Then the men came, and they brought beer and schnapps, because none of them had ever seen an American before, and I guess they wanted to see what we looked like. But we ate well for a few days. After a relatively short time, I was put on a train and taken to the Hans Udet Flying School. Hans Udet was a very well-known German ace in World War I. But he got disillusioned with Hitler and he committed suicide. But they still named the school after him. From there, we were put on a train and sent up to an interrogation center, which was on the north shore of Germany on the Baltic. And there you were put into a very small room. It was big enough for a cot and a bucket. And you'd be wakened all hours of the day and interrogated. And of course, our instructions were name, rank, and serial number, nothing else. And their ploy was, unless you identify yourself and tell us where you're from, we'll have to consider you a spy. But you knew what was going to happen because written or scraped in Morse code on the wall was the history of what your previous occupant did. And they all lasted for about 14 days, in which case all the messages stopped. So you could anticipate being there for 14 days, which is exactly what happened. And just before you left, you had your final interrogation. And the German, who could speak English very, very well, said, "We really knew all about you. Here are some of your papers." And long and behold, they had papers that had been reclaimed from the group dump, presumably by Italian workers, who then gave them to the Germans, who then distributed them. And then they put you on a train, and we were shipped off to Stalag Luft 3, which was the scene of the Great Escape. And that motion picture is essentially a documentary, except for the motorcycle ride at the end. That is strictly fiction. But the actor who played it did, in fact, really, he was an escape artist. And he used to escape regularly, find out what was going on in the vicinity, then let himself be recaptured. He was usually then thrown into the brig for a couple of weeks, then let go, and in a short time, he'd escape again. It was really kind of funny. But I got there in about June, and the camp was fairly well supplied. It had food, clothing. It also had 10,000 prisoners in it.
Wow.
And it wasn't until September when the Russians started coming close. This camp, incidentally, was on the Oder River, and the Russians came there to regroup, and the Oder was close enough so that at the camp we could hear artillery. But the Germans didn't want us to be liberated, so just after the 1st of January in 1945, we were evacuated. We were given about a half a day's notice and told to put together what we could carry. I very quickly made a sleeping bag out of my blankets, toilet paper, needle and thread, but most everybody else just had their blankets, so I was a little more comfortable. But anyway, we started out walking in a snowstorm, and it was one of the hardest winters that Germany had had for some time. After walking for about 4 or 5 days, staying at nights in barns, warehouses, only one warm spot was a brick manufacturing company that had kilns. So we got warm that day. We were finally put on a train. These were boxcars. There were about 50 crammed into what the French used to call a 40 and 8. 40 men, 8 horses. We were locked in. They had a hole cut in the floor, which was your potty. And we were taken to a camp that was in Germany. It was Stalag 7A. It used to hold Russians and French, but a lot of them died. And the camp, it was a big one, but we were put in barracks, which we were told were built during the Napoleonic Wars. They were long brick stables, but they were sectioned off, and this is where we were to stay. There was a pump for water and a wood stove and not very much food. The Red Cross took some time to catch up with us, but ultimately they did, and we got Red Cross parcels. Generally, you buddied up with another POW and shared your jobs. My partner at the time was cooking a chicken. And we got the chicken because one of the Russians who had been a former prisoner there had gotten away, and I'm trying to get my time sequence right, but as Patton moved into that part of Germany, a tank drew up and knocked down the fence, and the sergeant who was in command stood up and said, "Is there anyone here from Worcester?" And I waved and said, "Well, I'm not from Worcester, I'm from Millbury." And he said, "Well, I'm not really from Worcester either, I'm from Farnhamsville." And he said, "What's your name?" And I said, "John Singer." And he said, "That's funny, I used to work for a John Singer." And I said, "Well, if you work in Farnhamsville at American Woolen, you work for my father." So he swore a couple of times and said, "Don't go away, stay here." So after he left, I stayed, and he came back with all the food he could have gathered. And there were gallon cans of corned beef hash, which was not the most likable meal, but I had plenty of those, bread, and some other essentials, including an axe and a knife, because we had to do our own cooking. And we were taking the barracks apart to split up the wood so that we could cook what food we had. And while we were hacking our wood supply one day, a Russian came by, and he was roaming around the place. This was after the Patton's people had left. And he asked if he could borrow our axe and knife. And we really didn't need it, so we loaned it to him. And as long as we were in that camp, he came back every day with a piece of cow, a chicken, or some food. Oh. And he treated us very well.
Better than corned beef.
Huh?
It's better than corned beef.
Better than corned beef, right. Finally, VE Day happened, and the camp we were in was about 10 miles away from an old German airfield. And the Air Force sent in DC-3s, C-47s, to fly us out, or as many as they could. And we were loaded onto the airplanes. It was kind of crowded, but it was okay. And all of a sudden, all the anti-aircraft around the field started shooting, and it was a Ju-52, which is the German equivalent of the DC-3, flew over the field. And that's one of the few airplanes that had windows that you could roll down. And everyone had their arms sticking out, waving a handkerchief to surrender. So we were pulled over to the side, and I'll swear at least 150 airplanes landed.
Wow.
All kinds. But the German Luftwaffe wanted to surrender to the Americans rather than to the Russians. And of course, they had bulldozers there, so these German aircraft ended up in a huge pile of pushed-to-side aircraft by the bulldozers. We finally were able to take off, and we ended up over Vienna on DE Day, and everyone was celebrating. We picked up a couple of bullet holes in the wing. The pilot couldn't find the airfield because all the flares were being shot off. But finally, after circling for an hour or so, he managed to locate. We landed and were trucked over to a hospital where we were supposed to be checked out. And there we found piles of blankets and notes saying, find a bush to sleep under, we'll take care of you in the morning. So in the morning, we were admitted to the hospital. We were given very thorough exams and put on a special diet. We got 4 meals a day, and the meals consisted of mostly steak and eggs. We were put on a hospital train and shipped out to France, where we were introduced to souvenir piles. In other words, these was all the junk that people had gathered so that anyone leaving could take a souvenir. So I found some binoculars and 2 rifles, which I took with me. I still have the binoculars, and I still have one of the rifles, but the other one was a semi-automatic, which they didn't think civilians should have at the time. But we did land after about a 3-week trip from France to Newark, because the Navy wasn't sure that all the German subs had found out that the surrender had happened, so we were zigzagging as if they were being hunted. We finally ended up in New York, or in Newark, put on a train and sent to Camp Kilmer, which was the place that all ex-POWs were sent. We were once again given medicals, only this time we were given a vacation. Actually, we arrived in Newark the latter part of August, and I was on leave until the following December. And that included a couple weeks at Atlantic City, all kinds of fuel, gas tickets, all kinds of ration coupons, and I found myself shipped to Fort Dix, which is in the center of New Jersey, which was only about 15 miles from my home. So I spent a good chunk of my leave at home, during which time when I was in the POW camp at Stalag Luft 3, I made friends with a guy who was a professor at the University of California. And one bit of advice he gave, which I followed, was, quote, when you get out of the Army, go to grad school. Because I had started grammar school when I was 5 years old. I was always a class behind in age, which made me the rump. But when I finally did get out of the Army, I wasn't yet 21, so I decided that I would go to grad school. I was accepted at MIT, except that I would have had to take an extra year because I didn't have some of the mandatory courses they required for grad school. So I was also accepted at Clark, which was the university I had graduated from. So I decided I would go to grad school at Clark. When I was an undergraduate, I did reasonably well first half of my freshman year. Second half, my parents had moved back to New Jersey, and I was thumbing my way to school in the morning for an 8 o'clock class, working restaurant for meals, and then thumbing back to Millbury to sleep. And towards the end of my second semester, I was called into the dean's office because I had been introduced to him by the principal of my high school and by the French teacher, who were both Clark graduates, who recommended that I go there. So he listened to them and admitted me. When my second semester turned out to be a disaster, he stopped by at the restaurant I was working at and said, "When you get out of work, will you stop by my office?" Which I did, obviously. He then showed me that I had flunked 2 courses my second semester, that I had gotten 2 B's in chemistry and physics, and a C in math. So he said, "I've discussed this with my wife, and we think the solution to your problem is that you should come live with us."
Oh.
It's hard to believe that a dean would do that, but he did, and I did, and I lived at the dean's house until I graduated. When I got in the Army and got out into grad school, I moved back in again. But that was a rather interesting time. What I basically did was household jobs, and I acted as chauffeur. They had a brand new Buick, which was not a difficult task. So I lived with the dean until I got married. The girl I married was in my high school class, and coincidentally, her family moved to Worcester from Millbury, and they were living about 3 blocks from the dean's house. So I saw her fairly often. We dated and finally got married, at which time I moved into their house from the dean's house and lived there until I got my doctorate.
You started a business here in Nashua?
A business, yes.
Yeah. And what was your degree in?
In chemistry. Actually, when I got my doctorate, everyone had part-time jobs. Tuition, believe it or not, was $200 a year, and you could make that by working summers, and which is what I did. I worked at Campbell's Soup Company during their tomato season. I earned enough to pay last year's tuition, because when I started, they loaned me money to pay the tuition, and then I would work the following summer to pay them back, get a new loan for the next summer, or for the next semester. Anyway.
So you graduated with a degree in chemistry.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, well, I got into grad school and finally got a PhD in chemistry. Back in those days, just about everyone had a job while they were in school. And I worked for a company in Framingham that made a product called EDTA, ethylene diamine tetraacetic acid. If you look on most liquid foods nowadays, just about anyone who uses water, in most pharmaceutical products, you'll find EDTA as a preservative and a stabilizer. And I worked there, I was the 5th employee. And I worked there for about 5 years, at which time Dow Chemical Company bought and moved the facility to Midland, at which time I decided that I didn't want to go to Midland. I visited there and didn't like it, so I quit. And I started importing EDTA from a friend of mine in Sweden, whose name was George Bush.
No way.
And we used to call him our George Bush.
Oh, that's funny.
But at any rate, I started doing research because at this point, hydrogen cyanide was being made available by DuPont in rail tank car quantities. And hydrogen cyanide had a bad reputation. It's what they use in the gas chamber. But actually, it's really a very nice chemical to work with. It's flammable, and the combustion products are carbon dioxide, water, and nitrogen, all non-toxic and breathable. So it's very easy to dispose of. Anyway, I found a new method, quite inexpensive, to make EDTA. And I raised enough money to start a small manufacturing facility and attracted the attention of Bradley Dewey. Dewey was rubber czar during World War II. He built all the rubber companies. And he was the Dewey of Dewey and Army, which was a big chemical company in Boston. But he was retired. He wanted something to do. And I had met him when he, years before, had tried to buy Bursworth Chemical, the first chemical company I worked for. And I told him that I didn't want to work for a big company, that someday I'd like to start my own. So he said, if you ever get any good ideas, let me know. So when I found the process for making EDTA, I called him at his office, and the secretary said, Mr. Dewey is in Sweden, and he won't be back for another 10 days. But I'll tell him you called. So I thanked her. That was on a Thursday. Friday afternoon, I got a telephone call from the secretary, and she said, Mr. Dewey will be in his office on Monday. Because I had given her a rough idea of what my process was. So he decided that we should build a good-sized plant to make EDTA, which we did. W.R. Grace ultimately bought it. And I left when they were split up because they sold their various divisions to different companies. And my company, the Old Hampshire, was sold to Dow, who also was a manufacturer of EDTA. And the employees complained to the government saying that Dow now had a monopoly because they were the only people who were making EDTA. At which point, the government made them sell Hampshire, which they did. And the company that bought it was a company from Holland who had been our distributor down south. And they moved the facility out to Lima, Ohio, which was our source of hydrogen cyanide. But, excuse me, every once in a while I lose track.
Well, they sold the company that you started, Hampshire. It's a Hampshire Chemical?
That was Hampshire Chemical, yeah.
Okay.
But
I lose track once in a while too, so that's all right. I had asked you a little while ago, when you were captured and you were in that cell and you were reading the Morse code, I had asked you, did you write something as well?
oh, sure. What you did, you wrote the date, the time that you were interviewed, and you did that daily so that people could count up and find out how many days you were there before your messages stopped and somebody else's started. So we knew pretty much that we were going to be there for that length of time.
Of these 14.
Yeah.
One other question. How did you become a pilot? What made you become a pilot?
Well, first of all, when I got out of college, I was undecided as to whether or not I would want to be a Marine or a pilot, Air Force. So I applied to the Marines first, and they told me that I had a polynidal cyst, and that made me not available for immediate duty, so they wouldn't accept. So I went across the street to the Air Force, and they said, don't worry about it, we'll operate on you and remove it before we send you to cadets. So I enlisted in the Air Force. I was sent up to Mitchell Field area in New York, put in the hospital, and they removed the polynidal cyst. And there were two of us who had the same operation. And I was in the hospital for about 5 days, was discharged, given a piece of paper to give to the squadron commander saying, give him light duty for a week. And they did. They put me in charge of the boiler room of the men's latrine. They put a cot, had someone deliver coal, haul out ashes, and kept me comfortable. And I was there for a couple of weeks when the camp commandant on a Saturday morning inspection opened the door, saw me lying on the cot, and said, my God, I forgot all about you.
Oh, no.
So the next morning I ended up on KP, and the cook said, does anyone here know how to take care of a furnace? So I told him what I had done, and he said, you take care of the furnace. I did. This was their stoves, huge things. At 5 o'clock, which was just before mess time, he came over and he said, would you like to do this all the time? And I could see the other guys scrubbing floors on their hands and knees. So I said, sure. So he said, come over to my tent after work. I did. And he said, I'll give you a pass. And I said, what for? And he said, you take care of the stove every other day. And the other day you have off, and here's a pass. Just keep track of the bulletin board so that when you get shipped out, you'll be on the right train. So this I did. And I kept track of those stoves as long as I was in the holding camp before shipment down to the Air Force. But
I would love to have you come back sometime and talk about your first day at flight school.
Well, when you got off the train, you were in Texas, San Antonio, at a pre-flight school. There you attended classes, you learned Morse code, and all the paperwork stuff that you had to do. Then you were shipped out to a primary flight school. Now you learn to fly in really 4 stages. The first was ground school, then you went to primary, then secondary, and then final. At primary, you learned how to fly. At secondary, you learned how to do all the things you did while you were flying. That is, navigate, bad weather, night flying, all the rest of it. And final was when you learned whether you were going to be in multi-engine or single engine. And in my era, they were after bomber pilots. So I ended up in a dual flight school and ultimately transitioned into B-24s. The B-24 crews were generally assembled in Texas. San Antonio was the nub of the whole thing. And my crew was put together in Brooksfield in Texas. From there, as a group, we were transferred to all places Westover Field in Springfield, Mass., which was only about 40 miles from Clark. Mm-hmm. So I spent a lot of time in Worcester. From Worcester, we were assigned overseas, and we flew from Worcester to Florida, to South America, from Dakar to Balim in Africa, then up African west coast to Tunis. And from Tunis, we waited until the Air Force had redone a German airfield near Foggia. Actually, that was at Cerignola. And we flew as a group to Cerignola, and our bombing runs were virtually all to southern France, Austria, southern Germany, Yugoslavia, Ploesti, that area. And I was on my 40th mission when I was shot down. And I don't know if I've mentioned that story already or not.
Yes, you did.
I did. Okay, so we won't go into that.
But I'm running out of time.
Oh,
So I would love to have you come back at another time if you have the time.
yeah, and I assume you'll edit this.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Very little, though. Very little.
Well,
I want to thank you for coming on my show.
oh,
And I have to mention this. Your birthday is the same birthday as my secretary, and she wanted me to make sure I told you that, and I'm on the air telling you that. So she thinks you're very special.
who is this?
My secretary.
Oh,
Can you say hi to Marie on the TV?
Oh.
Hi, Marie. See, I mentioned it. Ladies and gentlemen, I was fascinated by listening to the story, and I'm fascinated by the courage. I'm fascinated by this generation. We can learn a lot from this generation. And these stories must be told to the next generation to realize what they've gone through to protect our freedoms today. It's imperative that these stories get captured and retold over and over again. And thank you for your service. And thank you for
Good.
coming on the show.
incidentally, how long did I talk?
About 50 minutes. That's not enough. We got more time. Until next week, thanks for watching Speaking with the Senator.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.